The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek Ranch as I made my daily rounds. The cool autumn air filled my lungs, while the familiar sounds of cattle lowing in the distance brought a sense of peace that had been part of my life for all 43 years. This land had been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather had built the original homestead with his bare hands in 1945, and my father had expanded the operation to what it is today, 200 acres of the most beautiful cattle country in the state. I stopped my truck at the eastern fence line and stepped out to check a section that needed repair. The weathered wood had served us well, but nothing lasts forever out here in the elements. As I worked, I could not help but glance over at the new development that had sprung up across the road. Oak Ridge Estates, they called it. Just 2 years ago, this had been Old Man Johnson's corn fields. Now it was dotted with enormous houses that looked completely out of place against the rural backdrop. The construction had been difficult enough to endure. The constant noise, the dust, the trucks coming and going at all hours. But I had kept my complaints to myself. Everyone has the right to develop their property as they see fit. That was a principle I lived by. What I did not anticipate was how the new residents would feel about living next to a working cattle ranch that had been here decades before their concrete was poured. The first complaint started rolling in 6 months ago. A letter from someone about the smell, another about the early morning tractor noise. I tried to be neighborly, explaining that this was agricultural land and those things came with the territory. Most seemed to understand, even if they did not like it. But then came the formation of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, and everything changed. I finished securing the fence post and wiped my brow with my sleeve. The community meeting was scheduled for that evening, and I had decided to attend. The notice mentioned discussion of community standards for adjacent properties, which clearly meant my ranch. I was not part of their HOA, but I thought it best to hear what they had to say directly. The community center was packed when I arrived that evening. I settled into a chair at the back, feeling immediately out of place in my work jeans and boots amid the sea of business casual attire. The meeting proceeded with typical neighborhood concerns, landscaping requirements, approval of paint colors, rules about holiday decorations. And then came the introduction of the newly elected HOA president. I would like to introduce Patricia Montgomery, who will be taking over as president effective immediately, announced the outgoing president, a mild-mannered man who had always been polite in our limited interactions. Patricia Montgomery strode to the podium with the confidence of someone used to being in charge. Her perfectly highlighted blonde bob did not move as she nodded to the crowd. Designer clothes, expensive jewelry, and a permanent look of dissatisfaction completed the picture. "Thank you all for your trust," she began. "I have big plans for Oak Ridge Estates. We need to focus on making this the premier community in the county, and that means addressing some issues that have been ignored." Her gaze landed directly on me, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room temperature. Particularly, we need to address the adjacent properties that are affecting our community standards and property values. That awful farm smell wafting over the fence line is simply unacceptable. I have had guests refuse to come to my home because of it. And the unsightly views of industrial farm equipment and those dirty animals are not what we paid premium prices to look at. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable. I sat perfectly still, my jaw clenched. This was not merely a complaint. This was a declaration of war against a way of life that had existed here long before the first shovel broke ground on their development. As the meeting concluded, Patricia, or Karen, as I heard some residents whispering, made a point of approaching me with a too wide smile that never reached her eyes. Mr. Johnson, I am so glad you could join us. I think we have a lot to discuss about making some changes to your operation. I tipped my hat politely. Ms. Montgomery, my family has been ranching this land since 1945. Not much has changed in how we operate, and not much will. Her smile tightened. We will see about that, she said, before turning away to chat with board members. Driving home that night, watching the silhouettes of my cattle against the moonlit pasture, I had no idea just how far she would go to get her way. The battle for Willow Creek Ranch had only just begun. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday, sandwiched between an electric bill and a Tractor Supply catalog. The official-looking envelope stood out immediately, and a sense of unease settled in my stomach as I tore it open at the kitchen table. What unfolded from those crisp pages was nothing short of audacious. "Dear property owner," it began. "This letter serves as formal notice that your property has been found in violation of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association community standards and aesthetic requirements." I blinked in disbelief, reading further as the letter outlined a list of demands that made my blood pressure rise with each bullet point. The HOA was requiring that I repaint my barn from its traditional red to an approved earth tone, relocate my cattle to pastures not visible from Oak Ridge Estates, remove all farm equipment from view, and install decorative fencing to shield the ranch operations from their sight. The letter concluded with a 30-day compliance timeline and the threat of daily fines for noncompliance. It was signed by Patricia Montgomery, HOA president, with a flourish that spoke volumes about her self-importance. I slammed the letter down on the table. The sheer audacity of this woman and her association attempting to dictate what happened on my property that was not even part of their development, was beyond comprehension. I had never signed any HOA agreement. My ranch predated their community by generations. The legal standing for such demands was non-existent. That afternoon, I drove over to see my neighbor Hank, whose family had ranched the adjacent property for nearly as long as mine. His reaction mirrored my own. "They tried the same thing with me last week," Hank revealed, pulling out an almost identical letter from his desk drawer, "telling me my silo is an eyesore and needs to be repainted or removed. The whole thing is absurd." We spent the afternoon calling other agricultural property owners in the area, discovering that everyone adjacent to Oak Ridge Estates had received similar notices. It was a coordinated effort to change the very character of the rural landscape to suit urban sensibilities. The next day, I drove into town to speak with the county clerk. She helped me pull property records that clearly showed my ranch boundaries and confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had absolutely no jurisdiction over my land. I also discovered that many states had right to farm laws specifically protecting established agricultural operations from exactly this type of encroachment. Armed with this information, I returned home feeling more confident. That confidence was short-lived. As I pulled into my driveway, I spotted 3 figures standing at my property line. Patricia Montgomery was unmistakable with her designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, clipboard in hand, inspecting my property as if she owned it. Beside her stood 2 men in polo shirts emblazoned with the Oak Ridge Estates logo, one taking photographs of my barn and cattle. I parked my truck and walked toward them, struggling to maintain my composure. "Can I help you folks?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral despite the anger building inside me. Patricia turned, her expression a mixture of condescension and distaste. "Mr. Johnson, we are conducting an inspection of the violations outlined in our letter. The condition of your property is even worse than I remembered. Ms. Montgomery, you are aware that my property is not part of your HOA, correct? I kept my tone measured. She waved her hand dismissively. Your property directly impacts our community values and aesthetics. These eyesores, she gestured toward my weathered barn, are visible from our homes and affect our property values. The board has determined that adjacent properties must comply with our standards. That is not how property law works, I replied, feeling my patience wearing thin. Your authority ends at your property line. One of the men stepped forward. We are prepared to offer guidance on how you can modernize this operation. For starters, these animals should be moved to the back acres where they cannot be seen or smelled from the road. I took a deep breath. These cattle rotate through pastures on a schedule designed for optimal grazing and land management. They have been doing so for decades. I will not be changing my agricultural practices to suit your aesthetic preferences. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Perhaps you do not understand the influence our association wields in this county. We represent 96 homeowners with significant tax contributions. Your outdated operation is a health concern and a nuisance. My ranch is fully compliant with all county agricultural regulations, I stated firmly. I am not subject to your HOA rules, and I will not be making any changes based on your demands. Patricia snapped several more photos before turning to leave. We have ways of dealing with people who do not cooperate, Mr. Johnson. The county commissioners are very interested in new development and tax revenue. You might find yourself facing more than just our association if you continue to be difficult. The threat hung in the air as they retreated to a luxury SUV parked on the road. I stood watching them drive away, the dust from their tires settling on my boots. The tranquility of ranch life had been shattered by the intrusion of people who had no understanding or respect for the agricultural heritage that had shaped this land. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I wondered just how far Patricia Montgomery would go to get her way. Little did I know, her next move would cross a line I never imagined possible. 1 week later, another official-looking envelope arrived in my mailbox. This one contained a notice that temporarily froze me in place as I read it in disbelief. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA was officially approving the use of the community-adjacent property border for overflow parking during a special event scheduled for the following month. My property. They were approving the use of my property. I immediately called the number listed on the notice and reached the HOA secretary, who seemed confused by my objection. Oh, Mrs. Montgomery assured us this was all arranged, she explained. The event is her daughter's wedding, and they need the extra space for guest parking. I ended the call more confused than when I started. No one had spoken to me about any wedding or parking arrangements. This was the first I was hearing of it, yet Patricia Montgomery was proceeding as if she had my consent. The next day, I stopped by the local hardware store where community news traveled faster than official channels. Old Jim behind the counter filled me in on what everyone in town was talking about. Oh yeah, big society wedding coming up. Patricia Montgomery's daughter Caroline is marrying into the Whitfield family. Old money from the city. Word is they are spending a fortune to transform the Oak Ridge Common area into some fancy venue, supposed to be the event of the year. Further conversations around town revealed more details. The wedding was planned for the last weekend of the month, exactly when I had scheduled the seasonal rotation of my cattle herd to the eastern pasture that bordered Oak Ridge Estates. This rotation was crucial for my operation. allowing rested pastures to recover while moving the herd to fresh grazing land. 2 days later, I spotted unfamiliar vehicles parked at the edge of the Oak Ridge Common area that bordered my property. Men in khakis with measuring tapes and clipboards were walking the area, occasionally stepping over onto my land to take measurements and photographs. I approached one, who introduced himself as the wedding planner's assistant. "Excuse me, but you are on private property," I informed him. "This is Willow Creek Ranch land." The young man looked confused, but we were told this area was available for the wedding setup. "We are planning to extend the reception area to capture the pastoral backdrop." "That pastoral backdrop is my working cattle ranch," I explained, "and nobody has discussed any of this with me." He apologized and retreated to make a call. Within 30 minutes, a sleek car pulled up and a woman in an impeccable business suit emerged, introducing herself as Vanessa, the wedding coordinator. "Mr. Johnson, there seems to be some confusion," she began, her professional smile never wavering. "The Montgomery family has arranged for their daughter's wedding to use this beautiful setting. Mrs. Montgomery assured us that all arrangements with neighboring properties have been finalized." "Well, she assured you wrong," I stated flatly. "No one has spoken to me about any wedding, and I certainly have not agreed to have any part of my property used for the event." Vanessa's smile tightened. "Perhaps there has been a miscommunication. The wedding is Caroline Montgomery's special day, and we have been planning for months. The ceremony and reception are designed to showcase the beautiful countryside views that your property provides. Mrs. Montgomery specifically selected this location because of the picturesque backdrop." "That picturesque backdrop is my livelihood," I replied. "And more importantly, I have a scheduled cattle rotation that weekend. The herd will be moved to this very pasture the day before the wedding." For the first time, Vanessa's composure cracked. "Cattle here? That is impossible. We have 100 guests coming, some from out of state. The reception tent will be set up right along this border. There cannot be cattle here." I pointed to the fence line. "Everything on this side belongs to Willow Creek Ranch. Your setup needs to stay on Oak Ridge property." "Mrs. Montgomery will not be pleased," Vanessa said, her voice taking on a warning tone. "She has a very specific vision for her daughter's special day." "Then Mrs. Montgomery should have spoken to me before making promises about my property," I replied. Over the next few days, I watched with growing concern as delivery trucks arrived with tents, chairs, and decorations. Workers began setting up an elaborate venue on the Oak Ridge Common area, right along our shared property line. String lights were hung from posts, some of which appeared suspiciously close to, if not actually on, my land. I consulted my ranch calendar with growing anxiety. The cattle rotation was not optional. The western pasture was nearly grazed out, and the herd needed to be moved to fresh grass. Delaying would mean expensive supplemental feed costs and potential health issues for the cattle. The eastern pasture, with its lush green grass, was scheduled for grazing specifically at this time of year as part of our sustainable ranching practices. As I watched more wedding preparations unfold, I realized with growing certainty that Patricia Montgomery had deliberately scheduled this elaborate event, knowing full well about my cattle rotation. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. She had found a way to force a confrontation on her terms, using her daughter's wedding as leverage. The collision course was set. In 1 week, Caroline Montgomery's fairy tale wedding would meet the reality of Willow Creek Ranch's working schedule, and something told me that Patricia was counting on me to back down rather than disrupt her carefully orchestrated event. She had drastically underestimated a third-generation rancher's commitment to his land and livelihood. The next morning, I drove to the Oak Ridge Estates Community Center with a plan for reasonable compromise. Despite the underhanded tactics Patricia had employed, I had no desire to disrupt a young couple's wedding day. Surely we could find a middle ground that would allow both the wedding to proceed and my cattle to rotate as scheduled. The HOA office was a recently renovated space with modern furniture and framed photographs of the development in various stages of construction. Patricia Montgomery sat behind a large desk, two board members flanking her like guards. Her expression soured when I entered. "Mr. Johnson, do you have an appointment?" Her tone made it clear that unscheduled visits from ranch owners were not welcome in her domain. "Ms. Montgomery, we need to discuss the wedding scheduled for next weekend," I said, removing my hat as I took a seat without waiting for an invitation. "I understand it is your daughter's special day, and I have no intention of causing problems, but there are some serious issues we need to resolve." Patricia's perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently on her desk. "The wedding preparations are well underway. What possible issues could there be at this late stage?" "For starters, some of your setup is encroaching on my property," I began, keeping my voice calm and reasonable. "And more importantly, I have a scheduled cattle rotation to that pasture the day before the wedding. It is a necessary part of my ranch operations." The two board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, but Patricia's expression remained stony. "Mr. Johnson, surely you can delay moving your cows for one weekend. This is my daughter's wedding we are talking about. Guests are flying in from across the country." "I understand that, and I am willing to work with you. I have some suggestions that might help us both," I said, pulling out a folder of carefully prepared alternatives. "I could install temporary aesthetic fencing along the property line to create a visual barrier, or I could rotate the cattle to the northeastern section of that pasture, keeping them farther from your event while still giving them access to necessary grazing." I laid out several other compromise options: adjusting the timing of the rotation by a day, having ranch hands present during the event to ensure the cattle stayed at a comfortable distance, even offering a section of my property farther from the wedding site for overflow parking as a gesture of goodwill. Patricia barely glanced at my proposals. "These are not acceptable. Your entire operation needs to accommodate this event. The smell alone would ruin everything. You need to keep those animals completely away from the area during the wedding weekend." "That is not possible without significant cost and disruption to my business," I explained. "The cattle need to rotate on schedule, or I will face feed costs and potential health issues with the herd." "That sounds like a personal business problem," Patricia said dismissively. "Our HOA has approved this wedding venue, and we expect cooperation from neighboring properties." "Your HOA has no authority over my ranch," I reminded her, feeling my patience wearing thin. "I am trying to be a good neighbor by offering these compromises." Patricia's expression hardened. "If you continue with this harassment over a simple community event, we will be forced to take legal action. My husband's law firm specializes in property disputes." The threat hung in the air as I gathered my ignored proposals. "I am not harassing anyone. I am defending my property rights and business operations. Please have your wedding planners contact me directly so we can work out the details of keeping your event off my land." As I turned to leave, Patricia added, "And Mr. Johnson, any disruption to this wedding will result in immediate legal consequences. I am documenting all of our interactions." The next morning, I visited Thomas Green, a local attorney who had represented several farming families over the years. His small office above the hardware store was cluttered with books and files, a sharp contrast to the sterile HOA headquarters. Thomas reviewed my situation with a frown. "You are absolutely within your rights, Jack. Your ranch is protected by state right-to-farm laws, and the HOA has zero jurisdiction over your property." He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "But fighting this could get expensive. Patricia's husband is with Henderson and Associates in the city. They have resources to drag things out." "So what do you suggest?" I asked. "Document everything. Take photos of any encroachment. Keep communications in writing when possible, and proceed with your normal ranch operations. They cannot legally stop you from rotating your cattle on your own land." As I left his office, I noticed whispers and glances from people on the street. At the diner where I stopped for lunch, conversations hushed when I entered, then resumed at a lower volume. Betty, the waitress who had served me breakfast twice a week for 15 years, seemed uncomfortable as she refilled my coffee. "Everything okay, Betty?" I asked. She glanced around before leaning closer. "Just so you know, Jack, people are talking. That Montgomery woman has been telling everyone your ranch is unsanitary and unsafe, saying you have got disease-ridden animals and dangerous conditions. Most folks who know you are not buying it, but the newcomers are getting nervous." The smear campaign explained the strange looks. Patricia was poisoning the community against me, preparing the ground for the confrontation to come. That afternoon, another certified letter arrived, this time from Henderson and Associates law firm. It was a cease and desist letter, demanding that I halt all plans to move cattle to the eastern pasture, as it would constitute a deliberate nuisance and disruption of a private event. The letter threatened immediate legal action if I proceeded. As a final attempt at resolution, I attended the emergency HOA board meeting called to address community event logistics. The small community center was packed with Oak Ridge residents, many of whom I had never met. I took a seat in the back, feeling the weight of unfriendly stares. Patricia commanded the room from the podium, her voice carrying with practiced authority. "As you all know, my daughter Caroline's wedding next weekend is a significant event for our community. We have guests coming from across the country, including several prominent families. Unfortunately, we are facing a situation with the neighboring ranch that threatens to disrupt everything." What followed was a masterclass in manipulation. Patricia painted a picture of a stubborn, unreasonable rancher deliberately threatening to ruin a young couple's special day. She spoke of unsanitary conditions, aggressive animals, and outdated farming practices without a shred of evidence. By the time she finished, sympathetic murmurs filled the room. When I stood to speak, offering my perspective and compromise solutions, the damage was already done. Eyes that might have been open to reason were now closed by Patricia's theatrical performance about her daughter's ruined wedding dreams. The board voted unanimously to pursue all available means to ensure the wedding proceeded without disruption. I left the meeting with the bitter taste of defeat. Patricia Montgomery had successfully manipulated the community against me, setting the stage for the confrontation to come. As I drove home under a darkening sky, I realized that compromise was no longer possible. The battle lines were drawn, and it was time to stand my ground. Back at the ranch, I spread my grandfather's original property maps across the kitchen table, along with more recent surveys and legal documents. If Patricia Montgomery wanted a fight, she would get one, but it would be on my terms, with the full weight of the law behind me. I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could find about agricultural property rights in our state. The discovery of our state's robust right to farm statute felt like finding buried treasure. The law specifically protected established agricultural operations from nuisance complaints and interference from newer, non-agricultural neighbors. Even more importantly, it explicitly stated that local ordinances, including those from homeowners associations, could not restrict normal farming operations on agricultural land. Armed with this knowledge, I called the County Agricultural Extension Office and spoke with Agent Peterson, who had assisted our family for years. "You are absolutely in the right, Jack," he confirmed after hearing my situation. "The seasonal rotation of cattle is a normal agricultural practice, and the Right to Farm Act protects such operations, especially when they predate neighboring developments." Peterson agreed to provide an official letter confirming that my cattle rotation was not only legal, but represented recommended best practices for sustainable grazing management. He also suggested I document everything meticulously: property boundaries, communication attempts, and any encroachment onto my land. That evening, as I was reviewing the documents, an unexpected knock came at my door. When I opened it, I found three people standing on my porch: a middle-aged couple I had seen at HOA meetings, and a younger man I did not recognize. "Mr. Johnson, I am David Wilson. This is my wife Carol and our neighbor Michael Trent," the man said somewhat nervously. "We live in Oak Ridge Estates, but we are not here on HOA business. Quite the opposite, actually." I invited them in, curious about their visit. "The truth is," David continued once they were seated at my kitchen table, "many of us in Oak Ridge are fed up with Patricia Montgomery's reign of terror. She has fined me twice for having the wrong shade of beige on my exterior trim. Carol had to remove her garden gnome collection after being cited for unapproved lawn ornaments." Michael nodded. "She rejected my solar panel application 3 times on different technicalities. When I finally got county approval that overrode the HOA, she scheduled landscaping improvements that blocked some of my panels with new trees." "We heard what she is doing with this wedding situation," Carol added, "using her daughter's event to try to force you to change your ranch operations. It is wrong, and not everyone in Oak Ridge supports her." Their visit revealed something I had not considered. Patricia Montgomery had created enemies within her own community. These Oak Ridge residents offered to stand as witnesses if needed, confirming that my ranch had never been a nuisance and that Patricia's actions were part of a pattern of overreach. The next day, I contacted neighboring ranchers who had faced similar battles with encroaching development. 6 of them agreed to meet at my barn that evening to share strategies and support. The gathering felt like a council of war as we sat among hay bales, maps and documents spread out before us. "Document everything," advised Henry Miller, who had successfully fought off a similar attempt to restrict his operations. "Take time-stamped photos of your property line daily until the wedding. Record any conversations if legal in our state. And stick to your normal schedule," added Frank Cooper, whose family had ranched the next county over for 4 generations. "Do not change your operations one bit. The moment you accommodate unreasonable demands, you set a precedent they will exploit." As we talked into the night, our collective knowledge and experience began to form a strategy. Document everything, maintain normal operations, know the law inside and out, and be prepared for Patricia's inevitable escalation. The next morning, I called a surveyor to officially remark my property line where it bordered Oak Ridge Estates. The markers would be temporary, but would clearly establish the boundary that the wedding setup had already begun to encroach upon. I also purchased a GPS device that would allow me to document my cattle's exact location at all times, proving they remained on my property. With 3 days remaining before the wedding, I took detailed photographs of the property line, documenting how the wedding setup had already placed chairs, an arch, and decoration stands several feet onto my land. I sent formal written notices to both Patricia Montgomery and the wedding coordinator, advising them of the encroachment and requesting immediate removal of all items from my property. The response from the wedding coordinator was a polite acknowledgement with promises to address the issue. The response from Patricia was silence, a silence that felt more threatening than any explicit threat could have been. That evening, my neighbors from surrounding ranches returned with additional support. Two brought extra hands to help with the cattle rotation. Another brought his son, a lawyer specializing in agricultural law, who reviewed all my documentation and confirmed I was on solid legal ground. Together, we formulated what locals began calling Operation Cow Parade, the perfectly legal, perfectly timed movement of my cattle to their scheduled eastern pasture grazing area. We planned the rotation down to the minute, ensuring it would be conducted professionally, safely, and completely within my rights as a rancher. As I watched the sunset that evening from my porch, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The battle line had been drawn, not by me, but by Patricia Montgomery when she decided my generational ranch would be the sacrificial lamb for her social aspirations. If she wanted to witness the reality of life beside a working cattle ranch, I would make sure she got a front row seat to exactly that. The day before the wedding dawned clear and crisp. I rose with the sun as I always did, checking my cattle in the western pasture one last time before their scheduled move. They were ready for fresh grazing grounds, already gathering near the gate as if they knew what was coming. I drove my truck along the property line for my now daily documentation and stopped cold at what I discovered. Overnight, the wedding setup had expanded significantly onto my land. What had been a few chairs and decoration stands was now a complete invasion. A white carpet aisle, dozens of chairs, a flower-covered arch, and a raised platform for what appeared to be a string quartet, all positioned several yards over the property line onto my ranch. I took meticulous photos and videos, capturing the survey markers in the same frame as the trespassing items. The timestamp function on my camera documented the date and time of each violation. I then called the wedding coordinator's number, which went straight to voicemail. "Vanessa, this is Jack Johnson from Willow Creek Ranch. The wedding setup has encroached significantly onto my property overnight. This is trespassing, and I am documenting all violations. Please remove all items from my land immediately. Also, as previously communicated, my cattle will be moving to the eastern pasture today as scheduled. Please inform your client." I had barely ended the call when Vanessa appeared in person, looking harried and stressed as she approached from the Oak Ridge side. "Mr. Johnson, please," she began, her professional composure cracking. "We had to adjust the setup due to some drainage issues on the Oak Ridge side. It is just for one day. Surely you can be reasonable about this." "Reasonable would have been discussing these changes with me before implementing them," I replied calmly. "Reasonable would have been respecting my property rights from the beginning. The setup needs to be moved back to the Oak Ridge side of the property line." Vanessa glanced nervously at the cattle visible in the distance. "And about the animals, Mrs. Montgomery assured me you had agreed to postpone their move." "I have never agreed to any such thing," I stated firmly. "As I have communicated multiple times, the cattle rotation will proceed as scheduled. The herd will be moved to this pasture today." "But the wedding is tomorrow. We cannot have cattle here during the ceremony." Her voice rose with panic. "The cattle will be on my property, where they belong," I explained. "What happens on my land is my business, just as what happens on Oak Ridge property is yours. I recommend you keep your setup on your side of the property line." As Vanessa frantically made calls, I returned to the barn to begin the cattle rotation preparations. Within 30 minutes, my phone rang. It was Patricia Montgomery. "How dare you threaten to ruin my daughter's wedding?" she began without preamble, her voice shrill with rage. "I will sue you for everything you have if you move those filthy animals anywhere near the wedding venue." "Ms. Montgomery," I replied, keeping my voice level, "I am not threatening anything. I am conducting normal ranch operations on my own property, which is my legal right. Your wedding setup, however, is currently trespassing on my land." "Do you have any idea who my husband is?" she demanded. "He will bury you in legal paperwork. You will spend years in court and lose everything." "I am fully aware of my rights under the state's Right to Farm Act," I answered. "Are you aware of the penalties for criminal trespass and false claims?" The call ended with Patricia promising unspecified consequences for my actions. I proceeded with the planned cattle rotation, joined by my neighboring ranchers who had volunteered to help ensure everything went smoothly. We moved the herd with careful precision, documenting with GPS coordinates that the cattle remained fully on my property at all times. The 70 head of cattle moved peacefully to their new pasture, grazing contentedly on the fresh grass of the eastern section, directly across from where the wedding venue had been established. As evening fell, final wedding preparations continued on the Oak Ridge side. Workers cast nervous glances at the cattle, which paid them no mind, focused instead on their dinner of lush green grass. I ensured that the herd was comfortable and well settled for the night, knowing that tomorrow would bring the confrontation that had been brewing for weeks. The morning of the wedding arrived with a flurry of activity from the Oak Ridge side. Delivery trucks, caterers, and the string quartet arrived early to complete the setup. The first guests began to arrive around noon, 3 hours before the scheduled ceremony. I watched from my property as women in formal dresses and men in suits emerged from luxury vehicles, their expressions shifting from anticipation to confusion as they noticed the herd of cattle peacefully grazing just yards away from the ceremony site. Some laughed and took photos. Others looked aghast, carefully maneuvering in their formal shoes to avoid the reality of being in the countryside. At one point, the wedding coordinator approached the fence line, looking desperate. "Mr. Johnson, please," she begged. "The ceremony starts in 2 hours. Can you please move the cattle just for a few hours?" "The cattle are exactly where they are supposed to be," I replied. "They are on my property, following the rotation schedule I have maintained for years." The confrontation I had been expecting arrived with the mother of the bride. Patricia Montgomery appeared in a peach color,